Hi. Um, thank you all for being here today. This section, I'm really happy how it has all come together. I want to give a brief introduction, and then I'd like each of the artists to speak about some of the themes that I'm trying to address in platform, and how it relates to the works that are the specific work they're presenting. And then Susanna will sort of draw out some of the themes that other idea, and she may ask some additional questions, but we're really interested in having a conversation about how really the current commemorative landscape is changing, and how artists are responding to that right now. And so I was invited to do platform, which is always large-scale, monumental scale sculpture, and so I started to think about what is happening in large-scale sculpture right now across the world, and so very much immediately it came to mind was the idea of how we're seeing the displacement of public monuments, or defacing, displacing, taking down of public monuments, throughout the world as decolonial gestures of really trying to sort of look at problematic histories and challenge them and look for ways to correct them, perhaps offer other narratives to be celebrated publicly. So I think within that environment, how it raises questions where, and I was thinking about, of course, kind of Confederate statues in the United States being taken down. Here in New York, the Theodore Roosevelt sculpture being taken down after many years of conflict around that sculpture in front of the Museum of Natural History. And I work in Mexico, and recently a statue of Columbus was taken down on the Paseo de la Reforma, major avenue, and it really sparked a lot of debate about what should replace Columbus in that case. And and there was a lot of discussion about it should be a woman, it should be an indigenous woman, should it be a mythological figure, and the debate continues. And artists were asked to respond in different ways, and it's a really it's a very rich and complex discussion. But these sites, these public monuments, have become spaces ultimately to debate questions around history, how we write history. So I invited, artists that I thought were addressing this very directly, some of them in their work, but also artists who were kind of creating counter narratives or creating unmonumental gestures, either through the materials they use, the subjects that they chose to honor, and so we can talk about that a little bit. But really, but the larger questions that I sort of want to get at is, in each of the contexts that the three of you are working in, how does the idea of monument play into your thinking? But how do we think about commemoration today? And what role does it have culturally? What might we look to agree upon together, if that's even possible now, about what to memorialize, what to monumentalize, and in what form? Because particularly I was interested in how is this sculpture is inherently tied to monument, and inherently tied to history, and with that comes questions of conquest, questions of traumatic histories often. And so how does sculpture now, and how are the aesthetics responding to this moment of really questioning traditional forms around public sculpture? And so I asked for a specific order. Iván, could you just start the conversation?
Hi, very happy to be here in this panel and to meet in person you guys, and then thanks for coming. Also very happy to be part of the program. I think it's it's an amazing show. So I really like the show. So I've been this question about like how are we concerned about monuments. I've been kind of since I was very young. I wouldn't say attracted, but like conscious about them. I grew up in kind of in the projects in Bogota, and I moved when I was a teenager to the city center, and that was my first discovery of how like the country represent themselves, or how like power, let's say, and history represent. Yeah, like power represent. How do they draw the history in the city? And it was new for me as a teenager. So I used to hang around and used to, as a teenager, also like climb up statues and get drunk with my friends up there. And also as a defiance to these authoritarian figures, no? Like I was a suburbs guys from the projects or like almost favela, and it was like, who's this guy with the big mustache and like doing in my neighborhood. So I was conscious about it in a young age, and then as I started working, also I come from a family involved in politics, militant, so also these narratives of history has been kind of an issue at dinner every time. And then as I started working as an artist, it was kind of also an evidence to me. I always been interested in public space and how in public space there are displayed these narratives of mostly a military history, of a history of winners of wars, a history of like super proudness, and I always felt strange just because that's not history, and that's not, I'd never felt represented into that. So as an artist, I started generating more like strategies and questions at the beginning, like I'll say 12, 13 years ago, start doing ephemeral interventions in public monuments. Maybe I'm going to talk only about one, is that I did in Bogota. Is this monument in the park named Parque Nacional. It's park in the center of the city, and they have this small monument statue of bust of a guy named Francisco de Orellana, which is like a unknown conquistador, not very famous, but he. So the pedestal says like Colombia honors Francisco de Orellana, discoverer of the Amazon. And until today, he's still in the history books the discoverer of the Amazon. There was people living there before he arrived, and then and then it's the only monument that related to the Amazon in the city. And I felt is almost like an insult to the indigenous communities, to the people who and the nature. To the Amazon itself. He named the Amazon because he believed there was Amazon women in the forest. So I covered his figure, his image with mirrors. With this idea, I was like, why are we honoring this? Still honoring these persons and not the context, everything that is around. And I was lucky enough, because it's a park, there's only trees around, so it was the kind of the nature that was kind of decorating the image of Francisco. So kind of this work is from, 2010 maybe, or this intervention. And it's somehow related with the installation I'm doing here, which has to do pretty much the same, this, instead of like cutting this verticality in a more horizontal way. And then I also think what you say about it's not an issue about replacing monuments for other monuments, but I think it's replace a conception of public space as a representation of one ideology, or we need to think maybe more a public space in a more horizontal way, a more inclusive way, and not a place to just use it as a propaganda tool, which has been used until today, but more like a place that we can share and we can modify, and then we don't think about like maybe permanent stuff, but ephemeral. That's some things, I think.
I'll come back with some questions too, but Novo?
Hi everyone, thank you very much for this invitation.
Can everybody hear? Is that okay?
Yeah, I'm very glad to be here as part of this exhibition. I have to say that everything that have to be removed from our cities in the world, we can't remove everything that have to be removed. But I want to speak about the very specific case of Cuba and my relationship with monuments and the political shape of our urban or sculpture relations. In this piece here, what it has been, I did almost nothing. Is the thing that I like the most, because to commemorate, to honor figures as Martí, like José Martí, is our national hero, our national thinker, is a very central piece, is a cornerstone in the Cuban culture. The Cuban government paint in white every year the bust, the sculpture of Martí during decades. And what I did was to accelerate this process and to think about how Martí will looks like in 200 years. And I used this idea and I applied 365 layers of white paint over his face, and the result of this process is a very unknown person, unknown people, unknown idea, and this speak about how the power, how the government raise every day, trying to honor, trying to build some ideology. The result is that this ideology is, we are losing the ideas that are in the base of our narrative. And sí. I scale one-on-one the face of Martí that is in every place, in every school, in every laboral center, in every state enterprise. I scale this bust, this face, one-on-one to the scale of the José Martí sculpture in the Revolution Square in Havana. This is a monument where every speech, every congregation, every meeting, political meeting happen in Havana. The Cubans follow this. I'm a little bit lost in my speech, but the idea is to think about how what we are commemorating, what we are the faces that we are follow, that we are in our time, no? And this is, yeah.
We'll come back to some.
Yeah, see, please come back, because it's very difficult to me to say something interesting and to say something interesting in English. Yeah, and after an incredible party yesterday night.
I think you did just fine.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ebony. So it was really interesting when Tobias had asked me to be a part oh no, it's back, had asked me to be a part of this conversation, particularly with this work, because I didn't really think about this work as a monument, but it definitely kind of happened as an accident. It's also really interesting what happens when an artist gets a little bit more time to think about something. Hashtag the lockdown was useful. But it was also super, super scary. So at the time when we were all inside, I was super eager to get outside, to get back to my studio, because it was the only place that I saw as a safe space during the time I was in Chicago. So when questions arise, the studio is always a place that we want to go to, wherever our work is, whatever our studio is. But the work actually is second to another work that I had done that started with a white peacock. After, coincidentally, at the time, the same year, I was at the New York Botanical Gardens doing a tour, and I found myself, I was constantly asking the question, what was here? What was here? What was here? Everywhere we would go on tour, I kept saying like, oh, what was here? What was here? What was here? And then I would always go home during the summers and other times during the year. But that particular summer, after being at the New York Botanical Gardens, I went home. And as I often would do, I would go to the Hope Botanical Zoo, which during the colonial period, it was called the Royal Botanical Gardens at Hope, and was an extension of Kew. And so I found myself also now coming back to this place, which I come to as a child and also come to many times as an adult, and now asking this question, what was here? And so because of my preoccupation or thinking about gardens for quite some time, I've always been thinking about gardens kind of as one in relation to the body, but then also thinking about gardens as an embellishment on a landscape. And so the Hope Botanical Gardens also is home to the Hope Zoo. And I would always go to the zoo. It's like the gardens, it had gone through like varying transitions of care, but then also too, it's also really interesting that this was a colonial project, that former colonial subjects seemed really interested in maintaining. And so anyway, so the zoo had in one section of its housing a number of birds that seemed to be in varying stages. And there was a lucine peacock, a white peacock, in an incredibly dark enclosure in molting. I had never seen a white peacock before, but to see also to such a bird that we associate with magnificence to essentially be going through its most ugliest point of transition was also incredibly haunting, and I just couldn't unthink that. So it remained with me for quite some time. And then when the Liverpool Biennial we had a conversation about work I was thinking about, what I was making, and they were like, yeah, would you like to do this? And I was like, yeah, and I'd also like to make a new work. And they were like, we don't have any money. And I was like, it doesn't matter, I'm gonna make this thing anyway. So I decided to make this first. I started with this white beaded encrusted peacock, and I just kept thinking about the tail of a colored peacock and how much that relates to the landscape. And if the landscape is an embellishment, and then also too, I came across a quote by Glissant thinking about the Caribbean, that the landscape is our only monument. And in thinking about the history of Caribbean spaces, or spaces like the Caribbean, right? Or post-colonial spaces, which the US is very much a part of. What would it mean then to pick up all of this beauty and look beneath it? What would it mean to reveal the ugliness? And to also think about how the landscape then also is in molting, that we're witnessing a shift. And so it was really interesting that at the time when I was making this white peacock, I was also supposed to have a show with the Contemporary Art Museum in St. Louis. And I just said, it was a work I was making in a much smaller studio space, and I couldn't see it. So I just said to them, hey, I have this new thing. Do you want it? And they said, sure. They didn't know what it was, but it's also really interesting to have used the museum as like an extended studio space to see this thing that I'd been making in a really narrow space and just to see how it would come to. The first peacock, the tail creeped up the wall and had images of bodies that would flow down its back. And then the white peacock sat atop golden conch shells. And then there was a pair of hands that met out. So after making that, and then also like everybody else, sitting at home, watching as everybody was leaving from their houses, taking to the street to protest around the Black Lives Matter movement. And as I was watching things burn, all I could think was, oh my God, the land is in molting. The land, we're actually collectively witnessing a changing of the landscape, whether it is physical, ideological, or social. The place was actually burning. So new land was in formation. And so it set me back in the studio to really rethink, okay, doing this peacock again. And so when the cry takes root, which is what the work is called, essentially calls into question the screams of the land. So it comes from, there's all of this beauty that we're witnessing, but it's also ugly. And then the peacock looks back at itself. So what does it mean then to witness your own undoing, to really contend with your ugliness as it is happening? And as the hands, as the tail lifts, what appears to be root systems are hundreds of lace hands. And so there's this moment of, what am I looking at? And then you realize what you're looking at. And then there's a pair of glass legs that sit below. And so I've always been also interested in conversations around visibility and invisibility. And I've also really loved the material of glass, especially after doing a residency a couple of weeks ago. I understand why so many more people don't do it. It's such a precarious and expensive material. But the idea of also thinking about bodies that are fragile, and then thinking about that in terms of a particular kind of material, pushing a material that comes to its like most fragile point when one frosts glass, just seemed as such an interesting metaphor to me. So for me, my monument then arrives from not a person, but a question. And I think that that's really the way we should be thinking. I mean, what does it mean then to share space, collectively public space? It should be a place for conversation, and not necessarily individual worship.
Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you, Tobias, for inviting me. Thanks to the artists, some of whom I know and I'm working with, and some of whom we're meeting for the first time. So I'm thrilled to have this opportunity. Just one way that I wanted to bring together what you all mentioned in your kind of, introduction to the audience to these pieces, was your own sort of relationships, not necessarily with monuments, but your experiences around monuments or around the places that you are addressing through your work. So Iván, I love, thinking of being like a teenager and using the monuments as a place for gathering and starting to question it. Novo, thank you for explaining how, Martí is this vernacular figure that's both in the domestic sphere, but then has this location in the urban landscape. And then Ebony, I really, again, thinking about, we think of gardens very blindly as leisure spaces and places where you can go and find a refuge, but literally, as in the case of your piece, like unveiling it, looking beneath the surface. And in reflecting all that, Ebony, I think you kind of tackled this already, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the context, the specific context of the pieces. I mean, not necessarily at the fair, but as you were working on them and what they're depicting. I mean, Iván, you work in Paris, but I think it's worth bringing up that who the figure is and, you know, the site that you're pulling from. And Novo, if you want to speak about, you know, Marti presented here in the US and your own relationship here. So maybe we can talk about positionality.
So I started working on these pieces, I would say 2 years ago. We were preparing them for a show that we made with Perutan about a year ago. And then I used to work very site-specific. I do a lot of work site-specific, and I usually, when I have a solo show, I try to spend time in a place, and if I have the chance, also work with different communities. It was not the case in this case, but I wanted to talk. I wanted to talk about these issues, like it's been an issue that has been part of my work for a very long time, but with the Black Lives Matter events also, and also different kind of protests that happened in Chile and in Colombia, it was an issue that was very present. And then I asked myself the question of like, go a little bit further, is what's going to happen with these objects that are getting removed, and what's going to be the next life of it. And then I like also to think, so the piece as a kind of a fiction of what could be this in the future, but also, but then this figure here is George Washington, and it's a sculpture that is at Wall Street. And I wanted to use a sculpture that was very iconic here in the US, of a person, a character that is very iconic and also has a strong history also related with slavery. Not only there's like different sides of the history of this character. I never shown his face because I also wanted, it seems to me also like an archetype of this male figure of a powerful and you know, the gestures, all the mannerism of these forms that is present in all different kind of public sculpture. It was also very representative of what's public sculpture or like public monuments today, which is mostly men with, as I said before, big mustaches and military like decorations. One of the first works I made also related, even I think I was in school. It's a series called Horses. It's small photographies where I erased there's these equestrian statues of kings in France. I just erased the kings and let the horses just by themselves. And then they look very kitsch and contortion, and that shows somehow this kind of the self-representation of power, how kitsch it is, how mannerist it is. So I didn't, like, this is George Washington, but it's not about him. It's about this that typology of male figure, dominant, and being a hero of a nation. And then I like it to kind of cruelly cut it in pieces and then make it, transform this image in an object again, make it like a planter out of it, and somehow as banal as a planter could be. And then also in a way showed how these icons we know, but some like we put in places, they're gonna be anyways like eaten by nature, and I don't know, maybe I hope in long time, but probably not that long in the future. So that's kind of the whole reflections around this specific work. I also like the body. I cut the body in 11 pieces, and the pieces has been spread, so they are not anymore together, and also this kind of demembration is going on to different places. And there is a protocol also that includes the work is the nature has to be grown in a really close area. So if for example, is the sculpture or a piece of the installation go to another kind of landscape, it has to be like invaded by the nature that it's grown locally. It's the name of the piece is Wildflowers, which I like to think that. I like to think also, when you're walking in the city and looks nature coming up, we're trying to make huge efforts to control it, to make our like city super straight and super with no holes and stuff. But nature always find a way to push it and then So you had to talk a little bit about that too.
Susanna, to work with Jose Marti is a way to speak about freedom, to speak about democracy, to speak about independence. No, it's not just Marti. Marti is a cornerstone to understand also Latin America, the Latin American from the 19th century. No, and to show this piece here is very important to me because Marti lived here in New York for more than 20 years, more than the half of his life in exile. And he organized the war, the independence war, the last independent war from here. And when I did the first piece, just after the Black Lives Matter movement here in United States, and I was walking in the streets in Havana, looking for some monuments to remove. I was like thinking, which monument we have to remove here in Cuba? And I said, maybe we don't have one. Maybe we don't need to remove a monument. We just have to think about this monument in a different way, no? And was and had the idea to say, then I will do the same that the government do with this boss that is the most iconic portrait of Jose Marti that was made by the sculptor Juan José Sigre in 1936, and I will do the same, but in a small time, in a small time, and I applied 10 layers of paint each day during a month, and when the authorities, when the people, the cultural authorities and the political authorities in Cuba came to the exhibition, they said, we have this is Marti, but this is a new Marti that is like this is the Marti of our time. This is the abused people. It's an abused person. It's a person that we use in many ways. We decontextualize the thing of Marti in many ways, and this is the result of we como que lo que hemos hecho, ¿no? Lo que
like what we've done.
yeah, lo que ¿qué?
This is what we've done to the
Yeah,
image.
this is what we've done, and it's this is the reason that I really the thing is that I do nothing with this sculpture. I'm just showing a political process in time, no?
So interestingly, I mean, Jamaica, I didn't grow up really with monuments, or like as I was hearing Iván and Reynier talking about the objects that were in the public spaces where they were. The only thing I could think of was Heroes Park, but it's it's situated in a place that isn't even, it's off to a corner, kind of. And it isn't a place that's close to pedestrian. You know, it's a really, it's part residential area, part commercial area. It also sits across from, or is widely surrounded by working class communities. So it's also interesting to see how that space has a particular kind of care, and then thinking about the space that sits across from it, you know? So, and then also too, in the, what was super interesting to me is, also too, is that our monuments often tend to be, infrastructure, you know? So we'll name things, we'll name highways after politicians, you know? We'll name buildings after people. But I have to say that the thing that was most striking for me during the course of the Black Lives Matter movement, and let me just also put a pin and say, like, the movement isn't done, you know? We kind of speak about it as if it's past tense when all the problems are still occurring. But what was interesting was that while the protests were happening here and then, or globally, and then also looking back home, a number of entertainers decided to go outside the U.S. Embassy to protest. And so it was also interesting to think about, what does it mean then for a community that's majority African descent, and the way they hold or think about Blackness within their own space. So they were protesting about the injustices that were happening to, and I put in quotes, our Black brothers and sisters in the US. While not more than 5 to 6 miles down the road, there was a woman in a working class community who was murdered by police, and her name was Susanna Bogle. And there was very little conversation about that. So it's interesting just to think about the weight of life. So George Floyd's life, in this context, had way more weight, in contrast in that moment to Susanna Bogle, who was also killed in a similar way. And I think, you know, what happens then, or one of the most powerful things in colonization, is when you convince the colonized that their bodies have no value, that there's another body that has way more value. And then for them to then show up and then not recognize that these two things are the same. And those are the products that continue to work. And those are the things that kind of spawn the questions that I think about. Or also too, you know, like how quickly the movement got co-opted commercially too. That was super, super interesting. When you would walk through neighborhoods, walking through Chicago, you would see businesses being boarded up. And I could not think about how biblical the moment seemed, you know? So just thinking about when, during the time when, like, Moses was trying to convince Pharaoh, and, you know, before the killing of killing of the first son, what did you have to do to save your home? You put the mark of the blood of a lamb on the doorway. And so everywhere I went and I would see a sign in a window, you know, Black Lives Matter, all I could think was, is this the mark in the window to show publicly that I am in support? But how does that actually work out? You know, every company was, you know, making all of these moves, but then how did it actually unfold, and how does it continue to actually unfold? Yeah.
We should be careful about time, but I did want to ask Iván, like, you work in Paris, and how you know, I think we're more familiar with a U.S. kind of landscape or monument, or even a Latin America, or my own, but how is this discussion playing out in Europe in terms of kind of critiquing history through discussing particular monuments?
It's very difficult. It's a very there's a nerve in Europe that you touch sometimes, or in France, that they like immediately react with like a kind of they go to an opposite and then kind of deny stuff, or like say these famous sentences like it was like that before. It was like that before for who? So like it was normal to do this or do that. It was normal for who? So, and then I think not only in France but Europe is very attached to their own history and they're very kind of proud of it. And I used to use this example as because I had to have these conversations all the time. And I'm from Colombia, and I think many Colombians here we have a messy history. And then independently on what kind of political spectrum we are, we admit easily, and then we can see with critical eyes our own history. So how come it's so hard for sometimes some people like be critical about their own history? And because they feel sometimes like asking a question is an aggression, and that's completely. I think also that's completely a reflex of like a power that was built on top of these strategies of you're not allowed to ask this question, and then you get into not only in the colonized but the colonizer believe that asking a question is like aggressing a system of thing and their values, and then so it really cuts since the beginning. So you can cut a plant that is just rising. The conversation is not possible anymore. So we won't touch these monuments. We won't touch because this is our history. But like, no, that's whose history and like whose history are you talking about? Like another figure I work about is Gallieni in France. He murdered like thousands of people in Madagascar. There's no monument in Paris that talk about like the people in Madagascar. They were like bring wealth to France. There's no like counterparts. There's only this male military men all around that are supposed to say something. They don't even say something about nothing. Like neighbors, they don't know who these guys are. Children, they don't know who these guys are. They just, and then people, when you ask these questions about this, like moving or questioning these places, they feel like, oh, no, you couldn't do that because you will be erasing our history. They don't even care about who these guys are. They're got used to see these figures up there, and then it's believed that that's a normal thing to have, as it's normal to have also in the big museums pieces from all kind of civilizations, as is normal, because they normalize this kind of structural violence. And then it's very difficult sometimes to be able to make a conversation without getting like these people, radicalized in some like positions which are kind of blind sometimes. So I have the experience to work on these issues in Latin America. It's a very different conversation. In Colombia, it's a very interesting moment right now where also a new kind of political energy, I would say, more than power. It's kind of allow people to ask these questions and to include like what is the vision of the indigenous communities, what is the vision of the Afro-Colombians. I think other places in South America these things are happening. In Europe it's very it's difficult. In Paris specifically, it's a city that is very African. It's an Arabic city. I think this is the city with most Arab speakers in Europe, also with maybe the biggest migration from Africa. So there's plenty of issues that kind of they deny to treat sometimes. They kind of make the blind eye, and then that generates this immense friction and tension. So it's a tough issue there. It's a tough.
Do you want to say? I have another. Just we're almost out of time, but I wanted to just sort of to kind of throw out thinking about if we're critiquing this historical way to commemorate, like what kind of models might we think about generating in the future, and within that, and this is my question, is more how we address, or each of you address historical time in your work. And when we think about monument, it's a very fixed, linear understanding of how time and progress, and it implies all these things. And each of you in different ways, take on that idea, or the traditional idea of historical time, but change it or play with it in different ways, and how that might offer critical ways to think about the future and what we monumentalize or commemorate, and in terms of time, how we might do that. Big question, sorry. But if anybody wants to answer it.
I don't know, Tobias. I don't know. I think it's funny. Like I was okay. So I think a big part of like all of these questions around monuments and what needs to come in place also has a huge thing to do with like the absence of knowledge that is shared in a formal or just an early, an early education about the people who are not present in these monuments. There would be no need for a monument about Black people or Black women or people of color or all peoples of color, LGBTQI, other people, if all of the contributions were being taught really early on, right? When I think about, like, say, for example, in my own education, my back home, I was taught about our national heroes, our freedom fighters, people who made, who fought for our liberation, for our nationhood, yeah? And I think if everybody understood all the contributors to their history, then there would be no question about like, why are these people absent? Why don't we know about these people? I think once you begin to put there's this weird thing about hero worship, eventually we recognize heroes are human beings, and the nature of human beings is when they figure out or they learn something that's terrible about that person, then it all becomes about that. So I think that there's always going to be a problem with placing individuals at the center of that conversation, no matter what. And so I think that if the idea then of, the idea of thinking about ideas, like thinking about collective responsibility, we're sharing space communally, and there's this thing that we're going to put in public space that all of us have to engage with, interact with as a community. I think fundamentally what it should be about is about ideas that will help us to become better collectively. This is not to suggest that there will not, that there might not be individuals who will become key to us thinking through those ideas. But I think the minute the access becomes an individual, there's always gonna be a problem.
I just wanna last thought was I'm gonna go very straight ahead. I think we all kind of like cultural elements, or we work in culture. I guess most of us we're here because of that. And I think thinking about Colombia, thinking about what's happening here also, and how this it's not only about the public spaces. Of course, there is a deeper thing behind. So what I think is like we should get involved from our own position without necessarily, in our own scale, in our own desire, but get involved in the conversation, because it's not only a conversation about like a piece of stone or a piece of bronze that is in the center of a park. It's about what the whole mechanism that made possible that thing to be there, and what it represents and what it radiates, because it's like a minute by minute, it's irradiating some kind of energy. And then I think we all kind of shared thoughts and questions and not many answers, but I think the questions are the important thing. And then what you say about like public space, a place maybe conceive this public space as a different tool, not an ideological and propaganda tool, but a place to share, a place to create community. And I think the most important is to get involved in those conversations in our own scale, in our own way, from our own corner, but just get involved. And that's what makes things change in the movement here in the US. It was because people got involved. And also that happened in Colombia, people got involved in their own scale, in their own neighborhood, in their own corner. So I think that's the important thing. That's the last talk.
We should probably wrap up.
Yeah. Oh, a wrap-up question.
Yeah, of course.
Well, I don't know if this is a wrap-up question, but maybe you all, I'm sure as artists you can turn it into a wrap-up question. But, I mean, Ebony, you said you didn't think of your work as a monument. I don't necessarily think any of you think of yourselves as monument makers. I don't even know if you all think of yourself as sculptors. So I'm just wondering if you want to maybe talk about these particular pieces or maybe the particular materials you're working with in relation to your larger practice. Or what's coming next, Novo?
In my case, I am starting to produce digital sculptures and digital works because we have many things, many solid, many things in this world. We have to stop to produce things in bronze, in concrete, in marble, in plaster. What happens if the world stop of produce monuments and things for a year, for example? What happened? No, we have this need to put something there in the urban space on in our houses. The human being have this Roman tradition to celebrate something in a solid shape, no? And in my case, I am moving my mind to the digital world, to trying to know. I have to drink water, and I have to eat to be here, but I don't want to produce more forms. It is a very complicated conversation with the galleries, because the galleries have to sell something, but the galleries can sell digital something too. It's just about the physicality of the ideas, no? And I am finding this physicality in the digital world now.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my decisions materially always lend itself first for me to ideas. You know, I do love materials. When somebody asks me, oh, what do you do or what do you make? I always say I make paintings. And I think that just has a lot to do with my way of thinking through materials. It also just has to do with, I guess, the way I was first educated. But yeah, I mean, I spoke a lot about the work first. I don't think I need to go any further, but what I'm thinking about next is I'm about to do a show with the New York Botanical Gardens, and I really hope they allow me to dig up their lawns. You know, that's my plan. I hope they will allow me to dig up their really pretty, pristine lawns. That's what I hope. The end.
Iván, do you want to say?
No, plants. I'll go for that. I'm working more and more on also using that kind of working together and collaborate with plants in different ways, in a historical way. So I'm working on some projects for Colombia, actually, to create like a outdoors garden, which is kind of related to these issues. To kind of play more with alive forms and other forms that I've been doing and using before as a sculptural. Sometimes I think of myself as a sculptor, but I was not trained as that. I feel like an imposter or a sculptor, but I like sometimes some mornings to think like maybe I'm a sculptor. But more like alive forms, and also I do, like, parallel to many things I do a lot of projects with children or high schools and or like groups of different communities. So it's interesting to mix some like formal things with also like social forms.
I think we'll leave it there, and I just want to thank you all and for sharing this, and it's just incredible to be with all of you, and thank you for doing this. And I think it's a conversation that we can continue to have. So thanks everybody. Thanks for coming.